know that you spend a lot of time working with businesses who want to do business in China. And I wonder what kinds of conversations are you having with those folks right now and helping to make those strategic decisions about where to do business, who to do business with, where to invest when it comes to China as a growing economy? How are you counseling your business clients?
So wonderful question. And I've had some of the big clients like the Apples of the world, but I've also had some smaller clients, a few of which I'm working with right now. And what I try to do, Aubrey, is I try to coach them, whether they're the big clients or the small clients, but I try to coach them on thinking about China in a more complex way than we used to, 30 years ago. So it used to be the case 30 years ago that if you just thought about, okay, well, I need an organization, I need our headquarters in Shanghai or in Shenzhen or maybe Beijing, but this is what we have to do and it's going to be fine. And, back then it probably was the case. Like if you were a multinational corporation and you wanted, back when I was doing my doctoral research and living in Shanghai in the mid 1990s, that was the case. Today, it's not the case. So first, of course, you have to have.
Today, we wanted to talk about why you are bullish on the Chinese economy. When do you think the Chinese economy will be bigger than the United States economy, and what factors are coming into play there?
It's interesting because, we think of the United States as the largest economy in the world, and it is, and it does very well in white-collar economies of high-end things like investment banking and accounting and finance. But we don't do well in terms of thinking as a nation about where we want to develop in the world. And this is what China does really well. Zhou Qnfei, who's the richest woman in China, she has a company called Lens, and they are the ones that developed the manufacturing supply chain for touchscreen glass for this little thing called the iPhone. She just spends so much of her company's time and energy on training the engineers that are managing the manufacturing supply chain for things like touchscreen glass on how to be more sophisticated. And so again, there are differences in terms of what we want as societies, but I think China's doing great. I mean, here again, people get very uptight and nervous, and they think that China is manipulating the numbers and it's a centralized state-run economy that you can't trust. And my team and I just don't believe that's true. Our team calculates that it's going to be around 2032 that China will become the largest economy in the world.
What about the instability caused by major international conflicts?
Well, again, this is a really interesting moment for China, because I think the international conflicts are significant. I think the U.S. is creating a lot of these because of, first of all, just the trade war, but then there are very specific things like the situation in Venezuela or the situation in Iran. China is really working hard to position itself as being an arbiter of the global trade issues, right? So not just global trade, but also global international stability.
Hi, Doug.
Hey, Aubrey. So good to see you. Always enjoy our China conversations, and I'm looking forward to another one.
Yeah, it's always good to see you. And again, the world is continuing to shift and there's always something new to talk about. Today, we wanted to talk about why you are bullish on the Chinese economy. And this is something that, we talk about often in our OGLT meetings. And it's obvious that your stance is that China is this world's second largest economy. And your stance is that it will continue to grow and overtake the United States. Let's talk a little bit about that. When do you think the Chinese economy will be bigger than the United States economy, and what factors are coming into play there?
So, I mean, it's a great question. And, again, it's all just sort of imagining and extrapolating out with statistics. But if the Chinese economy continues to grow at about 4 to 5%, which I believe it will, and the U.S. economy continues to grow at about 2.6 to 3%, our team calculates that it's going to be around 2032 that China will become the largest economy in the world. And we're pretty confident about that. I mean, here again, people get very uptight and nervous, and they think that China is manipulating the numbers and it's a centralized state-run economy that you can't trust. And my team and I just don't believe that's true. We think it's a very, very powerful economy. It's the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. And there are many reasons that you and I can go deeper into in this talk that are about that. We think that the projections of 4.5 to 5% growth rate are going to play out for the next several years. And so we're guessing 2032, China is going to be the largest economy in the world.
Okay. Yeah. And that's less than 10 years. Let's talk about the $1 trillion trade surplus. What can you tell me there?
Well, first of all, one of the things that's really interesting here is that this shows that Trump's trade war is not working. The whole idea of the tariff war and what we, think of as the trade war, is that, the basic notion is that you're supposed to increase prices at the border such that instead of buying things from China, we will buy them from the United States, and it will create jobs. But of course, as you and I have discussed many times, this is contingent on the idea that we have a manufacturing supply chain, whether it's in toys and light industry goods that, Walmart makes in China or has made in China, or it's in very complex goods like iPhones and iPhone components and modules. We don't have those manufacturing supply chains in the United States. We're continuing to have a tremendous amount of trade with China. Walmart continues to be the single largest exporter from China to the United States. iPhones continue to be made primarily in China. Of course, there's some movement to India and Vietnam, but for the most part, all the modules and components are still made in China, and many other goods are the same. And so that $1 trillion trade surplus, is really a marker of just how powerful China's economy is right now. And it shows that the tariff war is silly. And so, it's a really, really powerful dynamic and a powerful economy right now. And so we're continuing to watch that grow. And so it's a really interesting time.
Yeah. Another interesting thing is that Chinese automaker BYD surpassed Tesla to be the biggest EV manufacturer. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, here again, it's an interesting case. Tesla's an interesting case as sort of a caveat of what I was just talking about a second ago, because, if you are going to have tariff and a trade war, you need a manufacturing supply chain in the United States such that if you increase prices at the border, you will continue to have the ability to produce those goods inside of the United States. And Tesla is one of the interesting caveats here because, Tesla has the single largest gigafactory for electronic vehicles in the world, and it's based in Shanghai. And, they work with many suppliers that a little company called BYD, which you just mentioned, also worked with. But if you do increase prices at the border for goods that are made in China, like Tesla vehicles, Tesla actually also has a vertically integrated manufacturing supply chain in the United States. And so this is one case that sort of makes the trade war makes sense because, if you increase prices at the border, then people might just buy Teslas or electric vehicles made in the United States. The interesting caveat here is one you just mentioned, which is that BYD recently surpassed Tesla as the biggest electric vehicle automaker in the world. And, their cars are much cheaper than Tesla's. And, they're doing very well in China and in other parts of the world, not so much in the United States because the tariff war does actually work in the Tesla case, but they're a very powerful vehicle. And they're as you mentioned, the single largest electric vehicle automaker in the world right now. And so it's a very powerful moment for not just things like light industry goods, a la Walmart or iPhones, but it's, in this very, very innovative space, BYD's winning.
We've also talked about the ability of China to coordinate its municipalities. One book you mention a lot is Local Governments as Industrial Firms. And I'm wondering if that coordination impacts China's ability to just build things at scale. Like we've talked about data centers, renewable energy is a big deal, anything to do with space and biotech. So what are the differences between kind of the scale at which China is able to complete projects versus the scale that the United States is going to complete projects? Do you think those two things, is that related? And is that important to the growth that China is going to be seeing and has seen?
Yeah, and it's a great question, Aubrey. And I love the fact that you mentioned Andy Walter's work. I know I mention it all the time, but, my favorite article written from the mid-1990s was Local Governments as Industrial Firms. And it's, really, it had the foresight back 20, 30 years ago of really kind of thinking deeply about how China was creating a system that's not just driven by centrally planned 5-year plans, but it's actually about creating a culture of innovation amongst the cities that exist in China. And, economic growth is the main thing that Chinese leaders are judged on. If your locality, your city, your district within a municipality, your province is doing well, then you're going to be rewarded with advancements in your career. But it's not just about driving growth through mandates of economic development. It's also about creating a culture of innovation in very, very specific areas where the local governments are striving and thriving. And so you have these industrial clusters that arise in different places. And so what we see is, not just the production of light industry goods a la Walmart or iPhones, but we also see, you mentioned several of them. I mean, renewable energy. I mean, there are several provinces in China and several municipalities that are just knocking it out of the park in renewable energy. And then there are data centers, and there are issues with respect to space about rocket recycling, but there's biotech. I mean, again, we could go down the list of who's good at what, but the real key thing is that many of these areas get into very, very specific areas of innovation and development, and they become experts in these different areas and build industrial clusters around them. And so it's a really remarkable economy. Now, to your other part of your question, could the United States do this? Cases, as you know, that I often talk about is, there are cases, right? So Silicon Valley, it's, a leader in AI and does really well with a lot of high-tech spaces. But, building these industrial clusters in very specific areas takes time. It takes investment. And my favorite case study right now is, the city where I spend a lot of time, Phoenix, and Mayor Kate Gallego, and the fact that the state of Arizona and the city of Phoenix has attracted TSMC to become a leader in semiconductor manufacturing. And TSMC has, initially, after a $5.3 billion investment from the U.S. government under President Biden, TSMC was attracted to this space. And, then the number that was on the table for building 3 fab sites in Phoenix metropolitan area was about 160 billion, but I've recently heard that number has been pushed up to 500 billion. And if you think about 500 billion in investment in a place like Arizona, it fundamentally changes the economy of the state. And so we can do this in the United States. It just takes time, and it's not easy. But I think China is leading the world in really creating this culture of innovation around local governments as industrial firms. So it's exciting. It's an interesting time.
So let's focus on science and technology for a bit, and the innovations that we're seeing there. I know we're sort of in this AI race, right? So tell me about what's happening in AI in China.
Well, so you'll remember that I recently gave a talk on AI in China, and I, have been one of the curmudgeons and the people who are not skeptical about AI. I know it's a really important thing, but I'm nervous about what it's doing to higher education and academia and how kids are learning. But I've realized in order to be a responsible professor, this is the future, and I've got to teach students about this. And so one of my colleagues, who's the chair of the AI committee at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, pushed me to give a talk on AI in China. And it was a really interesting learning experience for me, Aubrey, because I was forced to think through not just, how to stop being a curmudgeon on AI, but actually to really kind of think through what's happening and what's different. And one of the things that's so interesting about AI in China, if you use AI and you just kind of ask questions and say, what's the difference between China and the United States and AI? Immediately, ChatGPT will come back and say, well, ChatGPT is excellent in creating very personalized interactions and very personalized dynamics. And DeepSeek is much more focused on mathematical models and not so personalized. And so, the United States is winning this AI war. But it's an interesting question of what that means, because yes, it's true, I guess, that DeepSeek is not nearly as personalistic as ChatGPT, but DeepSeek is being utilized by many Chinese companies to build the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. And so there's a lot of training and use of AI, but it's all with engineers who are basically just using it to create a more powerful economy. My favorite example that I cite and have done some research on because I know some of the key players. But Zhou Qnfei, who's the richest woman in China, she has a company called Lens, and they are the ones that developed the manufacturing supply chain for touchscreen glass for this little thing called the iPhone. She just spends so much of her company's time and energy on training the engineers that are managing the manufacturing supply chain for things like touchscreen glass on how to be more sophisticated. And so, again, there are differences in terms of what we want as societies, but I think China's doing great in AI. I think, DeepSeek and Seedance are just two powerful companies that are really driving, high-tech manufacturing, and it's powerful. There's also an interesting piece on this about what we might call humanoids. This is software and hardware that takes AI and the manufacturing supply chain, but builds it in a sophisticated way. And it's very, very interesting and innovative stuff. So I think that, we can't underestimate. We can't just sort of pat ourselves on the back and say Silicon Valley's the best. China's doing this too, and so it's a really interesting moment and an interesting model.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about, hardware and the hard edges of the technology. And let's shift a bit to talking about soft power and the cultural influence. I mean, I can't go on social media without seeing Labubu. So what's happening with China's influence on culture around the world?
Well, so again, it's a great question because we have these different categories of how we're thinking about the strength of China's economy. And, there are just the basic issues of the growth of the economy and the trade surplus, $1 trillion trade surplus. And, and then there are digging deep and sort of thinking about things like AI and where China's really creating leading space, not just with AI, but also with the building of the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. But your question is about soft power and cultural influence. And here I think there's a really interesting moment as well, Aubrey. I mean, we think of China as sort of being a hard-edged authoritarian economic and political system, but China is really creating a tremendous amount of influence in the world. So for example, I've talked about this before, but I'll just remind our listeners, the reframing of the BRICS economy. So BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that was sort of the original group. And then about a year and a half ago, 9 other countries were invited by China to join BRICS. And they're all in many ways closely tied to the Belt and Road Initiative. And China aspires to be the leader of the global South. China wants to, basically take the position that, okay, if the United States and Europe, you want to have your G7, that's okay. And you want to put us at the kids' table in the G20, but we're going to be the leader of the global South. We're the second largest economy in the world, and we are soon to be the largest economy in the world. And we are going to continue to develop and take a lead in what these economies are doing. I think Chairman Xi was and I know a lot of Chinese people who were very proud of the fact that he brokered the sort of détente or the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Of course, that becomes a much more complicated issue right now because of what the United States has just recently done in Iran. But they're very proud of China's leadership role and Chairman Xi's leadership role in developing these issues. And so we have, visa-free strategy, where China is taking a much easier stance on, letting people in and moving people around. And then, of course, there's a tremendous amount about, social media and the ways in which China is taking a leading position on thinking about issues like medical tourism and the ways in which it can develop in the world. And help the world. And so it's a really, really interesting time, Aubrey, not just in terms of the hard edge issues of trade and sort of economic power, but in the issues of soft power and cultural influence. And China's playing a big role.
Mm-hmm. And what about policy planning and strategic positioning of China in the global economy?
So again, I love the flow of your questions, because we're bouncing back and forth between these issues of, sort of the hard edge issues of economics and trade, and then soft power, but also, we have to respect and admire, I believe, how China is thinking deeply about industrial policy. Their 5-year plans they're known throughout China and known around the world, but these are not just sort of soft thinking plans where they say, well, we want to hit 5% growth rate for the next 5 years. These are very, very specific and detailed plans that are about industrial development. And, again, it's interesting because, we think of the United States as the largest economy in the world, and it is, and it does very well in white collar economies of high end things like investment banking and accounting and finance. But we don't do well in terms of thinking as a nation about where we want to develop in the world. And this is what China does really well. There's long-term planning consistency. There's organizational structure and organizational guarantees that are built into it. There's resource allocations that come from the central government, but again, are also really tied to our famous notion of local governments as industrial firms. And, there's a tremendous amount of development in this space. There's also development in this space, not just in terms of the allocation of resources to the building of things, but also the allocation of talent. So one of my favorite examples of this is, my team and I have, Shanghai Jiao Tong University is one of the famous universities in China that's not typically ranked with, Beijing University and Tsinghua University, but typically if you talk to anybody at Shanghai Jiao Tong, they're maybe number 4, right? So they're not Harvard and Yale, but maybe they're Berkeley or something like that. But about 20 years ago, they decided we shouldn't just be a high-tech university that focuses on engineering and finance, but we should also build a vocational technical system. And so they started another university called the Nanyang Polytech Institute. And, Nanyang Polytech Institute has become one of the most powerful vocational technical education institutions in China. And so to get to this point, there's policy behind this that is thinking about all kinds of things like long-term industrial planning and, organizational structure and guarantees, but also talent readiness. And so it's a really interesting time.
So we talked a lot about the reasons why the Chinese economy will be growing and potentially overtaking the United States as the -- 1 global economy in less than 10 years. What are the risks to the Chinese economy, major disruptions?
So, there are a couple of things that are always on the radar screen of critics of China, and they talk about these issues. Just to put this in very general terms, all growing economies that are investing heavily have local debt issues. And, there's questions of if you're investing too much and too much of the investment is coming through the government, you're going to create debt crises and, that can lead to a recession. Again, I'm pretty bullish on China's continued growth because I think they've been very smart about this. So I'm not that worried about a recession. The two key issues that people talk about all the time are the real estate debt and the real estate. Some people will call it a crisis. Now, I like to remind people, and you've heard me say this before, but I'll just remind our listeners, there is a little country called the United States that has had major real estate crises in 2001 and 2008. So real estate crises happen when you have a lot of overinvestment in real estate and building, and you don't have as many people buying things as you thought you would, right? And so China is going through one of those issues right now. There's been a tremendous amount of investment in not just the building of the economy, but in building of, a high-end housing market so that people will be attracted to come to places like Shanghai and Shenzhen and even smaller places like Shenyang and Zhenjiang. And so, yes, there is a real estate bubble, and they're dealing with that issue. I don't think it's as big of a crisis as a lot of people think it is, but it's an issue. The other thing that's talked about often is what they call the consumption crisis, right? And this is a really interesting case for China because culturally, China, but there are other countries in the world that have similar issues, but culturally in China, people spend less than they do in places like the United States. So the United States has about an aggregate savings rate of 10%. But if you sort of think about how much money people with wealth save compared to people with on the low end side of the economy, for probably half the U.S. economy, the savings rate is about 0, or some people estimate it at about 3.6%. And that's very low. And in China, the aggregate savings rate is about 40%, which means people just don't spend money. And, I'm not so sure that that's such a bad thing, Aubrey. Like, they're saving their money so that they can, invest in their kids' educations and, buy real estate. And so it's an interesting thing. These two issues are the two key questions that people talk about a lot, the real estate bubble and the low end consumption economy. Because if you remember, you and I have talked about this before, but the consumption economy goes back, 250 years to Adam Smith's notion of the virtuous cycle, where you put money into the economy such that you build things like manufacturing and build the economy, and then people spend money, and then they spend money and then make money. And China is on the lower side of that virtuous cycle because people just don't spend money. But again, I'm not so sure it's such a bad thing. I think it's probably being more responsible in terms of, saving money it's not a terrible thing culturally. And again, when I talk about culturally, these things go back to Confucianism and Taoism. And so it's just a different cultural mindset than sort of a capitalist economy where people make money and spend money.
Right. What about the instability caused by major international conflicts?
Well, again, this is a really interesting moment for China because I think the international conflicts are significant. I think the U.S. is creating a lot of these because of, first of all, just the trade war, but then there are very specific things like the situation in Venezuela or the situation in Iran. And here, I know, Aubrey, in our conversations, I just come out as the bullish on China, professor, but I think China is really working hard to position itself as being an arbiter of the global trade issues, right? So not just global trade, but also global international stability. So, like as the United States has created its trade wars and, done what the sort of surprising and aggressive things that it's done in places like Venezuela, and then, talk tough on places like Greenland. Not that long ago, Mark Carney, came over to China and sat down with Chairman Xi. And so the idea of China and Canada building a much stronger relationship because the United States is being such a tough talker. I think China is really working hard to position itself as an arbiter of the global international issues. So, internationalism is a big deal, and the global trade stuff is really creating a lot of issues, but I actually think that there's a really interesting space for China, and China's working hard to occupy that space, right? And so there is, of course, the big issue of, U.S.-China relations and the situation of Taiwan. And this is a wild card because, China fundamentally believes that, and rightly so, Taiwan is a part of China. And not only is that China's belief, but the United States agreed to that positioning, in 1979 and then again in the 1990s under Clinton. But as Taiwanese politics have changed over the course of the last 2 decades, we're seeing a lot more sort of muscle flexing around these issues. And so that's going to be a big one. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but, my hope is that we all come to sort of a peaceful outcome and a peaceful approaching of the handling of Taiwan.
Right. And we talked about this before where, the Japanese prime minister had stated, otherwise regarding Taiwan, and that caused some pretty swift and immediate consequences from China.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, China feels very strongly about this issue. And again, U.S. policy has been since the 1979 and more firmly since the 1990s has been fundamentally on the side of, one country, two systems, but Taiwan is a part of China. But when the Japanese prime minister sort of seemed to aggressively state things about a potential war or an invasion or, different, these would have fundamental consequences for Japan, it got messy. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting and important issue. But international relations matter. It's not just all about trade. It's also about how different countries, China, the United States, Europe, are all navigating the global political economy.
Right. Came up during this conversation as well, where China has a long-term plan, has stability over the years, and is growing. We've talked about how, you just mentioned Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, and his visits and his talk at Davos, where there is a bit of, for all of China's strengths, it's also somewhat about the United States' weaknesses and instability and perceived unpredictability. And leaders of other economies want to be able to count on their trading partners as growth partners. And so I think that this conversation is as much about China's strengths. It is some of it is about, the United States' weaknesses, which will allow it to be overtaken by the Chinese economy. So I wonder, I know that you spend a lot of time working with businesses who want to do business in China. And I wonder what kinds of conversations are you having with those folks right now and helping to make those strategic decisions about where to do business, who to do business with, where to invest when it comes to China as a growing economy? How are you counseling your business clients?
So wonderful question. And I've had some of the big clients like the Apples of the world, but I've also had some smaller clients, a few of which I'm working with right now. And what I try to do, Aubrey, is I try to coach them, whether they're the big clients or the small clients, but I try to coach them on thinking about China in a more complex way than we used to, 30 years ago. So it used to be the case 30 years ago that if you just thought about, okay, well, I need an organization, I need our headquarters in Shanghai or in Shenzhen or maybe Beijing, but this is what we have to do and it's going to be fine. And as long as I have those relationships and have sort of a core status as an organizational leader in these economies, it's going to be fine. And, back then it probably was the case. Like if you were a multinational corporation and you wanted, back when I was doing my doctoral research and living in Shanghai in the mid 1990s, that was the case. Today, it's not the case. Today, I always try to push my clients to think about a multi-level analysis. So first, of course, you have to have relations with the central government. Right now, that whatever that means, you can't just go lobby in Beijing, but you have to have friends. One of my dear friends who has helped me with a lot of things that I've done is an individual named Justin Lin, who was, an economist. He and I overlapped at the University of Chicago in the late 1980s, early 90s. And then he became the chief economist of the World Bank and then eventually moved back to China and is professor and dean at Beijing University. And, he's a member of the state council and he's just a very significant person in China and a very powerful thinker. He has an entire theory called the new structural economics, which is a gentle pushing back about neoclassical economic theory. So even though he was trained as a neoclassical economist under Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, he's kind of gently pushed back and said, the Chinese model is a little bit different. We're thinking very broadly about not just free markets, but also the relationship between free markets and the state, and how to do this. And so I encourage anybody to read Justin Lin's work on the new structural economics, because I think it's brilliant. But again, to this level of how I try to advise clients. So you have the central government. And so you need you need people and connections, whether they're the Justin Lin's of the world or people at a little bit lower level. You need people who are influential in Beijing, right? But remember also, you and I have talked many times, and we've even mentioned it on this call, local governments as industrial firms. You have to be thinking about how to influence people at cities all around China, right? And so do you know people in places like Shenyang or Zhenjiang or, Shenzhen or Zhengzhou? And so the second tier and third tier cities are really important. And then finally, you got to think about organizations and associations. You got to think about players that are having, one of the interesting players that I've become involved with really recently is the ACCA China branch, which is the Association of Accounting Certification in the world. And they're based in London, but they have a big China organization. And, they usually get, when I've come in and give talks to them, they have, hundreds of the most powerful CFOs of state-owned organizations kind of thinking through what they do. And so I like to just make sure that people are thinking about all three of these levels. Yes, central government matters. Yes, local cities matter, but yes, associations also matter. And then branding around those associations is really important.
And I think that's why, you're good at what you do, is because you've spent so much time in China developing those relationships with your team. You have the team on the ground in China and you make sure to spend as much time there as possible.
And just to that point, if we could call out my team, thank you for mentioning them. You're right. I spend as much time as I can in China, and I love the boots on the ground issues. But when COVID hit, I was terrified because I wasn't going to be able to be in China. And I have a China team, and these are people that I've known and worked with for over 30 years. Dashao Chen, Chris Gao, and recently passed late Diane Long. These have all been friends and mentors for how we do business in China. And, I wouldn't be able to do what I do without them. And so thank you, China team. Love you guys.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know they're such good humans and so smart and really influential in how you operate and even what we talk about here. Is there anything else that you want to touch on, Doug, for the discussion today about why you are so bullish on the Chinese economy?
Well, again, thank you for this conversation. I always enjoy talking to you about China. I feel like you are so good at asking the interesting, nuanced, hard questions. But we started with the very basic notion. I'm bullish on China. I think it's easy to state that China is going to be the largest economy in the world. And I think we're pretty strong in that prediction. And it's not just us extrapolating out 5% growth rates versus 2.6% growth rates, but it's also just how smart they've been at building the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world and all of the other things we talked about. I won't go over all of them again. But this is a really interesting time. And it's an important time for people in the business world, but also in the political economy world, to be thinking deeply about, how do we deal with this? How do we think about U.S.-China relations? How do we think about China's role in the world? How do we think about, you and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but when one of the interesting moments, and I know a lot of people in China were very proud of this, when President Trump went to South Korea and met with Chairman Xi and called it the G2 meeting, because it was, the group of two. It wasn't G7 and it wasn't G20. It was the group of two, like, okay, Chairman Xi, like, you and I are running the world together. And, that's a lot of big egos in the room at that kind of meeting. But I think to China, they're very ambitious and they want to reclaim China's position as being the most powerful economy in the world, which it was for thousands of years. So it's thank you for the conversation. And thank you for, just being such a good conversationalist and friend.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this was a fun conversation. I always learn something when we chat, Doug. So thank you.